Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 1st, 2023. It's Friday, so I'm going to be taking a couple of questions from viewers that were sent in to me and that can enable me to get at some of the key issues that we're facing at present. There are many of you who have written in saying, do you really think the U.S. can change? Do you think the U.S. can be trusted? Can Biden change? Isn't it a waste of time to do a mobilization to try and change the United States? Well, let's take this question of whether or not an aging, bumbling President Biden can become an instrument of good foreign policy on behalf of the United States. Now, Biden sent out a tweet on X before Blinken went to the Middle East yesterday. Actually, the tweet was 2 days ago. And he wrote that Hamas launched the October 7th attack out of fear of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. And he went on to say that to continue down the path of terror, violence, killing, and war is to give Hamas what they seek. We can't do that, unquote. Now, that's a fairly strong statement. He's essentially saying that the Israeli policy is terror, violence, killing, and war. It may be that that's not exactly what he meant, but that's what he said. Then the question comes up, does Biden intend to back up that tweet? Now, apparently, that was part of the message delivered by Blinken, who attended the War Cabinet meeting when he arrived in Israel. And what Blinken said to them, according to press reports, is you can't do in South Gaza what you did in the north. Then he later said in a press conference that Israel must act, quote, in accordance with international humanitarian law, unquote. Now, the question is, was Netanyahu listening? Was Blinken serious? Is Biden serious? Will he back it up? Well, what we know is that Netanyahu announced the war will continue, that as soon as they take care of exchanging more hostages for prisoners, the Israel Defense Forces are prepared to continue the assault on Hamas, and with that, likely the assault on the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. Now, it was also the case that it's clear that international pressure on Israel is growing. The Israelis just withdrew their ambassador to Spain in reaction to the Spanish government insisting on a ceasefire being permanent. The Global South countries are continuing to press the case for a peace conference, and that's what the Chinese did at the UN Security Council. But Netanyahu also faces pressure from the radical extremists of the settlers movement, which is represented prominently in his cabinet by Itamar Ben-Gvir, his national security advisor, and Smotrich, who's the treasury minister. They both threatened to bring down his government if he does not proceed with a renewed assault into Gaza. So the question then is, what would Biden do? Now we know, look, Biden's career is straightforward. He's been a servant of the oligarchy since he first came into the U.S. Senate. He is one of the leading supporters of banking deregulation. His state, Delaware, is the home of the credit card companies, and he's very close to the corporate cartels. Also, DuPont is located there. He's close to the big pharma. But then more importantly, he's always been a supporter of the policies of the military-industrial complex, including the war against Iraq. And then since 2014, he was directly involved in Ukraine and supporting the regime change coup of February 2014. And then as president, consistently supporting the war against Russia and taking U.S. money, so far $110 billion officially, to provide not just weapons for Ukraine, but salaries for Ukrainian government officials and to keep the lights on and so on. NATO just had a foreign ministers meeting yesterday where they pledged to continue the war. And Biden is still trying to push through another $60 billion package for Ukraine, as well as $14 billion to back up Israel's war in Gaza. So some viewers say, look, it's a waste of time to mobilize the U.S. You'll never get Biden to change. And would it make a difference? Would Netanyahu listen? And I think the example that I've given, and it's available on my webpage at LaRouche Organization, the article about Eisenhower's intervention in the Suez Crisis in 1956, the U.S. still has power of the control of money. If the U.S. withheld the $14 billion plus the $3.8 billion annual sum for Israel, that would have an enormous impact on the Israeli political establishment. The U.S. also has, well, actually, here's the question. Is Biden thinking that maybe the U.S. no longer has the credibility and he doesn't want to risk having the lack of credibility visible to the whole world? Well, that's where the question of a mobilization comes in. Remember, there's an election coming up in 2024. Biden is extremely unpopular, and part of his unpopularity is the war policy, where we're spending so much money on a losing war in Ukraine and now on a brutal war in Gaza, at the expense of protecting the U.S. borders, at the expense of infrastructure in the United States, healthcare, and so on. So the question is, would Biden be susceptible to that kind of pressure? Now, there's also something else which you should know about, which is called the Breakaway Ally scenario. Is Biden being held captive to that? Now, the Breakaway Ally scenario goes back to Henry A. Kissinger, who in 1974-75 as Secretary of State was presiding over the post-1973 war and was using the Arab oil embargo after that war to reorganize the world economy. This was after the Nixon decision to take the dollar off gold in 1971, and Kissinger used the boycott to have a flow of money from the West, the main oil users, into the Arab governments, which then put that money in Western banks. And this became a part of what's known today as the petrodollar system. And Kissinger was a manipulator of that. Now, in order to keep this kind of blackmail operation going, the various think tanks that Kissinger was associated with put forward this idea that they called the Breakaway Ally scenario. And what it essentially said is that Israel launches a preemptive war or a preemptive strike against its Arab neighbors, and then says to the U.S., okay, we started it, now you have to go in and finish it. And this has been one of the continuous themes in the background of U.S.-Israel policy, that Israel is capable of launching such a war and forcing the United States to respond. Now, if you look at the decision to send U.S. warships, 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the region, many other ships, putting U.S. Marines and forces on alert for possible action in the Middle East, the attacks against so-called Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq, the U.S. is almost back into a full-scale war situation in the Middle East. And this may be something that's in the back of Biden's mind, maybe not, but it's certainly a reality in dealing with any situation there, that the Israelis, and by Israelis now I mean the Netanyahu faction, the Greater Israel faction, is desperate enough that it would do something like that to force the United States to defend it. And it certainly looks as though that's part of the thinking behind the Gaza war, the scorched earth policy, and so on. Now, I'm going to be attaching a leaflet put out by the LaRouche Organization on November 14th called Words Are Not Enough, and it reviews the whole situation around the threat of the Breakaway Ally scenario and what the U.S. should do. Now, there are 3 things the U.S. could do. One is that the U.S. could say to Israel, stop it. We're not going to back you any longer if you continue this war. No money, no weapons, no strategic alliance. Secondly, the rest of the world would welcome that action from the United States. We've seen the whole global South join with those who are calling for a ceasefire at the United Nations. The United States could restore its credibility with much of the world if it were to put its foot down and say no to Netanyahu's scorched earth policy in Gaza. But then there's the third point. How do you assure a peace? And that would be you follow up the intervention with a real peace plan, a peace initiative modeled on Lyndon LaRouche's Oasis project. And I'll be having a link in the description section where you can see what LaRouche had to say and what the Oasis project is all about. But essentially, it's about economic cooperation between Israel and a Palestinian state to green the desert and to provide enough power and water for the economies of the whole region to develop in harmony. And that's ultimately the way that you achieve a peace. Is Biden going to do that? Well, I don't think he intends to. The question is, will you join us in supporting such a policy which creates an option to what otherwise is a slide toward global warfare? Now, I also have received questions on Kissinger. And you probably know he passed away a couple of days ago. Some people say he was mentally dead from the time he was brought in by the Rockefellers as a key advisor on U.S. government policy. But someone wrote in, I've heard that Kissinger played a role in setting up the Get LaRouche task force. What did he do? Well, let me say simply, first of all, Kissinger is a war criminal. What he did in the Vietnam War to extend it to bomb Cambodia, as many as 1 million people were killed in Cambodia due to Kissinger's secret bombing attacks. Before that, before he came into the government, he was a proponent of the idea of mutual and assured destruction, which he intended to continue, the idea that you prevent nuclear war by saying that if someone uses a nuclear weapon, we go all out with a deterrent force to wipe you out. The idea of mutual and assured destruction is what the MAD doctrine means. Now, Lyndon LaRouche was an opponent of that, and that's what his work on the Strategic Defense Initiative with the Reagan administration threatened Kissinger's whole raison d'etre, which is to use the nuclear balance of terror as a way to avoid big wars. But underneath that, you could continue the colonial warfare, such as Vietnam, such as the wars of the last 30 years. And that's what Kissinger was involved in promoting. Now, additionally, in the summer of 1982, LaRouche was involved in discussion with a number of Latin American governments, including especially Mexico and Mexico's president, Jose López Portillo. And he drafted a proposal called Operation Juarez, which proposed to the Mexicans who were facing a debt crisis, use the debt as a weapon. Tell the banks if they don't give you a chance to reorganize and restructure, you're going to cancel the debt. A debt moratorium, which was called by LaRouche the debt bomb. Now, this was a complete threat to the bankers who were the bankrollers of Henry Kissinger. And so it was at that point. Now, that was in the summer of 1982. On August 19th, 1982, Kissinger wrote a letter to then FBI Director William Webster, a Dear Bill letter, in which he called for an investigation of LaRouche and the LaRouche Organization. And this set in motion a whole series of events which led up to the Get LaRouche Task Force, bringing LaRouche to trial in 1988 and eventually putting him in jail as a political prisoner for 5 years. In the letter to William Webster, Kissinger opens, or ends, I should say, by saying, "It was good seeing you again at Bohemian Grove." So this was one of these secret enclaves where the establishment met to map out policy. But Kissinger was intimately involved in setting up the Get LaRouche Task Force. Now, what we're seeing is praise for him from all the media, the mediator, the negotiator. He opened China. He was going for détente with the Soviet Union. All of this is bunk. Kissinger's policy was British geopolitics, divide and conquer, open to China to counter the Soviet Union. Talked to his shuttle diplomacy was talked to Middle Eastern governments and then Israel and play them off against each other. This is classic British geopolitics. And the proof of this was his speech at Chatham House, the center of British intelligence. This, I believe, was in 1982 also, where Kissinger said the working papers he used as Secretary of State came from Chatham House, that he relied on their outlook and their policies. This was the height of the so-called special relationship, the so-called Five Eyes. And Kissinger openly bragged about his relationship with British intelligence in this. Now, unfortunately, his influence will not be buried with him. Just as in the case of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was considered his rival, but actually what was he a rival for? Who was the most accepted promoter of British geopolitics, Brzezinski or Kissinger? Their students, their people they mentored, are scattered throughout the think tanks, throughout the permanent bureaucracy of the State Department and the diplomatic corps, the Defense Department. Now, the best way to overcome this influence is to pursue a peace based on principle. And that's why we are insisting, through our International Peace Coalition, through promotion of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 fundamental principles for securing peace, we're insisting that the balance of power doctrine that's associated with Kissinger, or the arc of crisis British doctrine of Brzezinski, that these be cast aside and replaced by the Peace of Westphalia, the idea that it's in the interests of the United States and the Western powers to act in cooperation and coordination with the global South, and to pursue economic policies of development of mutual interest, mutual benefit. That's our initiative. That's how you eliminate the influence of such dangerous characters as Brzezinski and Kissinger, who have had a stranglehold on U.S. policy in the tradition of the Dulles brothers, the Harrimans, the Bush family. That's why the United States has been in permanent wars. That's why we're unable to escape the role of the global policeman in the unipolar order which they created. It's time to put an end to that. And that's what we can do if we pursue this policy of peace through development. So I thank you for your questions. Please share this video, share these documents, work with us. If you're interested in the International Peace Coalition, you can send us a note, an email to questions@schillerinstitute.org and say that you want to know more about the International Peace Coalition, and we'll get back to you. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.